Welcome to the Core Women Podcast, the place for women entrepreneurs, authors, and self-starters looking to build community and gain valuable insights through expert interviews with women at the top of their game. Join your host, podcaster, producer, expert coach, entrepreneur, and author, Dr. Summer Watson, as she aims to inspire and empower you through these candid conversations. Lean in and embrace the journey. It's time to start the show. Here's your host, Dr. Summer Watson.
Welcome back to the Core Women Podcast. Today's guest is Felice Upton, who is a transformational systems consultant, TEDx speaker, and organizational strategist who has spent over 2 decades leading change in some of the most challenging environments imaginable. From juvenile justice to nonprofit reform, Felice's career is rooted in the belief that no system is too broken to be reimagined and no leader is too overwhelmed to rise. She joined us to share what it really takes to shift culture, navigate complexity, and transform the hard stuff into meaningful impact. Welcome, Felice.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm so excited for you to be here. Before we dive into your professional journey, if you could describe your life to this point in one word, what would that word be and why?
I think my word would be interesting. That could be a sarcastic interesting. It's been a wild ride, and the lesson in contradictions, it's been interesting. Yeah.
Well, I love that word. We're going to get more into this interesting conversation. You've spent your career leading change in some of the most complex systems. Take us back to where the journey started and what called you to this kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was pretty young when I went out on my own and impacted by violence in my community. So survived a pretty lengthy relationship in my adolescence that was quite abusive and led me to being unhoused, led me to living a pretty rough life for a period of time, and had a couple of intervention points with adults that really had an impact on me. What I watched throughout my high school years was many of the young men and women in my community end up incarcerated, and watched a lot of adults look through us. And if you know, you know, right? That what that feeling is that adults don't truly see you, that they see you more as of a problem than as somebody who needs to be poured into and is deserving of their time. And that included guidance counselors and folks that were supposed to be there for me that really didn't see the struggles that I was going through other than the disruption that was causing to their system. And one of those key players was I had a high school boyfriend again who was quite abusive. And I've talked about that elsewhere and am always glad to talk about it because I think it informs community and that normalizes that we can talk about it and that those dark secrets can't exist when we shine light on them. But he had a probation officer who was young and a woman and who really saw me and often would talk to me about the options that I had in life. So later on, fast forward many years, I decided that I wanted to go back to school. And during that process, ended up applying to work at the Department of Corrections. This is the very fast forwarded version. And ended up being a probation officer myself and trying to pour back into my community in a significant way to disrupt some of those patterns, knowing that what I had lived through and watched many people that I knew deeply and cared about that got swept up into the system because of things that had come from the community violence we experienced.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I know that as we go through this interview, more will be explored, but that says a lot. I think you're absolutely right as you tell your story because certain people will look at each of us and have a perception about who we are, our lives. And many times when we see somebody, we think, oh, they had it good. And yet you tell your story and then all of a sudden you're relatable
Yeah.
or you inspire, or they feel a connection with you in some way, or they feel inspired to do something about their situation as well. Gives them courage, it gives them hope. So, thank you for sharing your story about being in a domestic violence relationship, even at a young age. And it happens, right?
Yeah.
and then ending up going out on your own at a very young age. And yet you still decided you wanted to go to school, you wanted to continue on with the evolution of your journey. And yet some people, because of that cycle of violence, get into a situation where it ends up in a very different situation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, in your experience, what's the difference between managing a crisis and truly transforming a system?
Yeah, I love this question. I really care deeply about systems reform. And I think often folks who know me well have heard me say this a million times, right? We treat the presenting problem and not the underlying issue. We want to swish whatever that thing is that's disruptive to our world and not look at what created that in the first place, the root system. And so we never truly lean into transformation because true transformation is excruciating, right? We've got to really analyze what's my role in this. I'm not perfect in this either. I'm playing into this system. Most of these systems are clearly not working. We keep doing the same thing. If we were in big business, we would have gone out of business by now. And I think most people would admit that it's also very frustrating because we keep reacting to whatever stimulus is right in front of us rather than say, what's really wrong here? And I can relate this back to the story I just told about my high school years, right? The guidance counselor who wanted me just to like show up to school on time, that saw the black eye, that saw that I had broken ribs one time. So there was a way to get upstream with that to say, there's something deeper going on. This isn't just a kid who's being difficult. And I think so many times our systems, rather than doing the deep design work of what are the pieces of this that are broken, we just say, like, how do we pacify this? How do we make it quiet so that people will be happy in this moment? And what that does is just kicks the problem down the road. So it's taking that longer look at it and understanding what's driving the real issue.
Yeah, I love that. You bring up so many good points because as somebody who has also worked in the system, you almost see why it's happening because you have a time frame in which to work with somebody. You are adhering to jurisdictional laws where you've got 23 hours to assess this person and determine da 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 da. And then you've got to like either get them in on a different kind of hold, or you've got to put them into a system, or you've got to refer them to somewhere, and A, B, and C. And so you're like
Yeah.
restricted in certain ways. Then you're looking at the field itself, right? And how we assess a situation, right? The first thing we ask is about the presenting symptoms. What's going on right now, right?
Yep.
And then we have a short amount of time to ask about the social issues, the family issues, the medical issues, the different issues that are going to impact the behavior of this person or why this person's being triggered or why this is happening with this person, right? And so you
Yeah.
dig a little deeper, but again, you're working within the constructs of a system.
Yep.
So I discovered why that happened. But it's funny that you say certain things too about like we could dig a little deeper. And so when I was going through my doctoral program, they said, you'd present a case, and one of my professors said, "Hey, Summer, you got to dig a little deeper about the resources, how you can help this person, blah, blah, blah." And I always remembered that. So when I did get in a system, I was like, okay, we got to dig a little deeper. We got to, I mean, even if we have 10 minutes, we got to do the
Yeah.
digger dive, right?
Yeah.
And so, but it can be hard because of some of those restrictions. And it's not that it's impossible to change. It's just getting that system to change. I mean, we look at our federal government, we look at state government, we look at county government, and you're looking at all these different governments or systems. It's like from top down, how long has it been that we changed a governmental system? And it's
Right.
extremely challenging, right? For various
Yeah.
reasons. So I love that you bring that up because, we could get into a very deep dive here about what are some of the ideas about how to change that system. So again, like I've asked you, what's the difference between managing a crisis and truly transforming a system?
Yeah. I think it starts by naming the issues and being able to identify what is the problem we're trying to solve here.
Yeah.
How do we put a plan or a framework around doing this thing differently? We've both talked about behavioral health now. And so I think talking about that too, do we have the right systems running? are we talking about these things? Much of my career was with women who were incarcerated as well as young people. And as an example, we talk about something like reentry. The crisis is they've got to leave on this date. And often it gets kind of trivialized that, like, they need a house and they need a car and they need like the very surface level things. And those are all very important. I will acknowledge that. But also, they may need a domestic violence survivors group. They may need community. They might need a hobby. There's a lot of hours that we're not at work. And so, what are we doing with that time? What are we doing with all of the things that help to make up a full and well lived life? Because having a job and just getting by while being lonely, while not having community, is no life at all. I do think we've got to start changing our definitions in this space to what is a life that is thriving and not merely surviving. And around the crisis, ensuring that we are taking care of our staff, that we are taking care of the players in these systems so that they aren't showing up overstimulated and in a way that is super reactive, that just causes more reactions. With every kind of crisis, there can be 5 more crises unless we do some pattern disruption. And in that way, I think this mimics the cycle of violence and domestic violence, that lots of our systems, especially carceral systems, act that way, where the domestic violence cycle has that lull where it's quiet because you had the behavior burst and now it's quiet. And then we pretend everything's okay and we apologize and then it happens again. So until we do that deep pattern disruption, I think we'll unfortunately end up the same place. So that's going to require really doing some analysis of ourselves and shining a light on the problems and acknowledging that I and we and all of us have been involved in those issues, and often inadvertently and certainly not deliberately. But when we talk about systemic reform, we have to talk about how do we all come together as communities.
Absolutely. All valid and important information because you've got to get connected with those cohorts that care, that really see and want the movement. It's all about community, right?
Yeah,
So it's like you're talking about systems from those that are incarcerated to those that work in the system and
yeah,
to other bigger systems, right? County systems, state systems, federal systems, and how they all interact with each other, right? And so when you're looking at that, a lot of people are like, well, we have about this much time to invest. So you need those cohorts that are actually investing more time in the reform of those systems and what
yeah,
that looks like. Because a lot of times when somebody's at the state level or federal level, they've been so far removed from it. It's like, do you remember what it's like to be here?
yeah,
And that's so important, having that foot in and one foot out, because to remember is to also gain momentum towards change, that memory and what could be, and having the hope that it can change with a strategic plan.
yeah,
It's so important. And you're absolutely right. I think a lot of times we get caught up because of all the constraints in this reactive mode rather than a responsive mode. And so we're not really paying attention to the emotional response we need rather than that reaction and that emotional agility to be able to make that change.
yeah.
With that said, you've led with a trauma-informed lens. Why is this approach essential for creating sustainable change, especially in justice-involved or high-stakes environments?
I think you can't help people be well if you're not well, is the shortest answer. And I think a lot about the stabilization of the foundation, right? Like, to weave these two questions together, that when we put things in place, I think about a library that I created with some partners a couple of years ago that helped to stabilize an environment. It's one more positive stimulus in an environment in a carceral setting where the books are brand new, there's a positive librarian there to greet you, there's a safe place for young people to go and really be themselves. That's half an hour a day potentially that folks are resetting. The employees have the opportunity to breathe for a moment. The young people have an opportunity to breathe. How do we start to create those positive stimuli within settings so that we can stabilize the foundation? Trauma informed is so important because it creates a facility where people in general are well. And I think that folks who have not worked inside probably don't understand that the experience for everyone is negative.
Mm.
and differently negative. And that's not to minimize the experience of one group or the other. It has to become a community at some point, and it is rough. You're seeing kind of the worst moments for many people all the way around. And so having an environment that's like design wise brings out the best in people, that is designed for healing, that is rooted in predictable, reliable environment, you're cramming hundreds and sometimes thousands of individuals into a space, and for youth systems smaller, but still dozens of people into a space that wouldn't naturally live together.
Yeah.
And then you add trauma, and then you add layers of vicarious trauma that staff are experiencing, that everyone is experiencing in this space. And if you're not careful about program design, about environmental design, about getting out and getting back to nature, lots of these environments are so overstimulating. You walk into many prisons and you think about even the noise.
Yeah.
So now you have a bunch of people who have been through a ton of trauma from different angles, and they're in a space that if you or I or people who have done tons of time healing, it's still overstimulating for us. So if you're working in that environment every day, the smells, the sounds, all of it is just too much. And then you add that there's a power dynamic that's difficult and all of the other things people are living through. They're not designed for healing. And so people can do their best within that environment. And I got to say, I've witnessed some of the best employees try to do incredible things with nothing.
Yeah.
And I think we have to rethink that model. And we really need to think about how design impacts you or I. If our bedroom was dark and gray and concrete, it might be less of a safe haven if we start to relate that to our own lives. And conversation about the other dynamics of prison is a different day, right? But
Yeah.
what we know is that predictable and reliable environments start to lessen violence all the way around. You start to have less use of force, more positive outcomes, and less injuries to staff, less injuries to incarcerated individuals. It just all the way around is better for everyone. So the tough on crime crowd or the opposite end, both would be satisfied in this model because it's just the right thing to do for human beings, all of them.
Yeah.
So again, like doesn't divide anybody, really calls to community to like do the right thing to humans, and that we kind of all show up in the way that we know we ought to be, even when people are having their hardest moments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will add to that with humans because they're all involved in making these changes. So even if I were to do a program out in the community, not a carceral program, but out in the community, I bring that community to the table
Yeah,
because it's so important to get their insight about what they think might work
yeah,
because you're going to make more forward movement by involving that community that wants to also see change.
yeah.
Less trauma, better environments, better programs, so that when we are looking at reentry, the transition also becomes a little bit more easy because they can go out and search for some of the things that have really helped them inside as well as maybe outside then.
Absolutely.
It's kind of like a mirror, right? And so those environments are certainly not just the programs, but the environments that we set up and create safe environments and environments to grow and innovate make such a difference as well.
One of the most compelling things that an incarcerated woman ever said to me that speaks to that is she had been learning something in a domestic violence survivors group that she tried to apply. And she said, Felice, I almost wish I hadn't learned that because I exposed my vulnerability and then went into an environment that re-weaponized it.
Mm,
And that's really stuck with me, that like
yeah,
we can do all of the therapy in the world, but if the environment just re-traumatizes right away,
yeah.
it's almost worse. So how do we start to balance that?
Right. Yeah. Interesting. And that's tough within a system, right? It's
Yeah,
like, especially in a carceral system where there's confines within
yeah,
that system. And it's like if you're learning these things and other people are not able to digest or accept these new approaches, guess what? they might be re-traumatized, the people that are trying to use these new approaches. It's kind of
Yeah.
like going into a family system. And,
Yeah.
it's like even in a family system and you try and make all these changes and you're trying to set boundaries and you're trying to do all these things, they're going to get pissed off at you because
Yeah.
they're going to be like, what are you trying to do? You're trying to change a system that maybe they aren't aware of or wanting to change because
Yeah.
they're so used to it, even if it is a violent system.
That's fair. Yeah.
I've seen it. I've seen it with kids and I've seen it with women who are in domestic violence situations where I will be at court and I'll see that woman who has been separated from that domestic violent partner or that partner who has sexually abused their children, and they'll slowly gravitate back physically to that partner
Yeah.
because of what they know,
Yeah.
because of a system that they're so used to. And it's like, I've seen it happen many times over. And that's why, again, when you say, well, why doesn't she just get away from that domestic partner that's violent? It's like, do you understand the
Yeah.
challenges that person is confronting in regards to acceptance, understanding, a community, all these variables that she's going to have to suffer?
Yeah. The interesting parallel there too is that that moment that the change happens, if you compare that relationship, is the most violent potentially and the most
Yes,
lethal. And so
exactly.
that understanding, and the same with a system, right? That if you're going to really do systems change, it's going to be ugly and mucky for a minute.
Yeah,
And that's okay. And not okay with the domestic violence situation. That's why we do lethality assessments. That's why we put protections around people. And that's why community has to show up for that woman or man.
right.
But in a system, how are we accounting for that? And how do we call out ahead of time that this might look ugly for a second, but we're really trying to solve this thing that keeps getting glossed over,
Yeah,
that may be convenient for the moment because it keeps people oppressed and quiet and whatever. If we want to break that loose, we're going to have to face some really ugly things together. And that's for that woman also, the more community can be around them to say, we know this is going to be a really terrible, potentially lethal moment for you. We're here for you and we're planning for that with you, really matters.
oh, that's huge. I love that example and that parallel because you're absolutely right. That was like an aha moment there where in domestic violence, when you try and leave that person or you're having a baby, the risk of violence, increased violence that happens or occurs. So you're absolutely right. It's like when change happens that stimulates that system or that environment, boom, guess what? You're going to have some ugly moments,
Yep.
or some very traumatic or very dangerous moments, even. Yeah. So the whole system, meaning those incarcerated on top of like the people, the admin people, to the people who are case managers, to the people that are, actually working with these folks, the corrections officers. Yeah, it can become very volatile.
That's correct.
Yeah, so much work can be done. Culture is the center of your work. Why does culture matter so much in systems, and how do you shift it when it's deeply embedded? And you've kind of touched on some of those things, but tell me a little bit more.
I have always viewed culture work as really trying to pull the best out of people and provide opportunities for growth and making sure that we are rooted in respect for one another across the culture. So that's everyone served by the organization, everyone who works for the organization, everyone in community that comes into the organization. With most of the systems that I've worked in, I've led volunteer programs, worked with community organizations, and really tried to build systems where we all really see each other in our full humanity, because I don't know how else to be, honestly. I continue to know people who have been incarcerated or on my watch that worked for me many, many years ago on teams that are the parents of youth who are incarcerated in systems that I served in, because often, they call and say, my kid's having this really difficult moment. And I say, like, as a mom, let's talk about it. That sounds so basic, but it's not. That often, we go into these systems and we stand on high and lose sight of, I didn't want to get to the leadership table, not to change the leadership table. What are we doing to reset those tables, to allow for equity, to allow for new voices and new thoughts to shape those spaces? So, I think it starts with respect. It starts with really looking for those things that we won't tolerate in spaces in our culture. And then what is it that we want to draw out of the humans that work and live in these spaces that are positive? Because we know a lot of negative things have happened in corrections, in social services, where folks have, short lifespans, high suicide rates, high levels of domestic violence and alcoholism and drug use because of a lot of things that they're seeing. This work is hard enough. How are we serving those who serve? Because a kid at a facility that I was in leadership at once said, these staff are not showing up in a way that they can fully see me because they're not doing well.
Mm-hmm.
And so true. I think so many times we are overwhelmed. Prisons, in many ways, have become social services safety nets. And when there's no other place for a person, where do we go? And then you're working with folks, and even if you're trying to do your best, are you able to fully show up because of what you've experienced? And so I think we start there with same trauma-informed principles, that predictable, reliable spaces to decompress and spaces to breathe. That's the one thing that I've been seeing since going into consulting this year is, as I work with clients, they're doing too much. They're doing too much too fast. They're in back-to-back meetings. They're extinguishing behavior bursts rather than really doing leadership,
Yeah.
which is looking at the long view. The tears are always right behind their eyes as I'm talking to folks. They're just overwhelmed and exhausted. And I don't know how you teach somebody to not be overwhelmed and exhausted when you are yourself. So how are we allowing ourselves the grace to have that space?
Yeah. So true. And I think a lot of times we're not taught that. We don't recognize that, or we do recognize that and think we can still juggle it all on our own.
Yeah.
And, that's just unrealistic. And
Yeah.
I think it's part of our ego that we can do this. We can juggle a zillion things and still be okay. And then life gets in the way, or, like you said, there's maybe a trauma incident, or, you just take COVID and look at that and look at not just the correction system, but like the medical system. We had the
Yeah.
same things going on and people were burning out. Doctors were committing suicide. They were burning out. They were seeing people get sick and die nonstop. It's
Yeah.
like the trauma there was so high for
Yeah.
everybody involved, right? And that medical system just got demolished and exhausted.
Yeah.
And we forget that all these people have lives,
Yeah.
normal lives. So guess what's happening in their lives? People in their lives have COVID. People in their lives are getting sick. People in their lives are losing jobs. People in their lives are moving or losing their houses. Like things like this happen. So it's
Yeah.
like, hello, have some grace. We got to have some grace for each other and for ourselves.
Absolutely.
So we have covered so much here. And as we actually wrap this up and come to the close of the interview, my last question is for leaders or organizations feeling stuck or overwhelmed, what's one tip they can use today to begin moving forward from survival mode to intentional transformation?
Take time every day to learn about leadership. It is a muscle. You are not a perfect leader. I am not a perfect leader. I have to continue to grow or I will atrophy. We don't know everything. So taking that deliberate time out. I don't care if it's a lunch, spend an hour reading a book in the middle of the day, or you will burn out and you won't be of service in the way that you think you are, because when we get so deep into problems, often we can't see it anymore. You have to step back to be able to really embrace the complexity. And that is the trauma response I've seen the most since the pandemic, is that inability to embrace complexity in leaders. And we can't do that without time and space. So my one tip is take the time, pour into yourself. You are your best resource.
Love that. Thank you, Felice, for joining me on the Core Women podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. You can connect with Felice Upton on LinkedIn, and you can check out her TEDx entitled The Hard Stuff on YouTube.
Thank you for joining us on the Core Women podcast with Dr. Summer Watson. We're so glad you're here and would love to connect more with you. Find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Core Women, and on Twitter at Core Women 1. For more about Core Women and Dr. Watson, visit corewomen.com. Want more support and resources for amazing women like you? Great! Join Dr. Watson and Jen Fontanilla at the Life, Love, and Money Collective, a core women production that aids in understanding the key traits that might be getting in the way of living a life that you are absolutely passionate about. Connect with Summer and Jen and find out more at thelifeloveandmoney.com.